Thanks for coming. I'm going to read a prepared statement for the police department first, outlining some of the crash facts. I'll take questions from you all related to that. And then I've got kind of a closing statement on behalf of the families with some information they'd like to share with the community about what happened in this event. So that'll be our order for procedure here today. On April 10th, 2017 at 2:43 a.m., a Mesa City police officer found a vehicle that had crashed and caught fire in the 400 block of 6th Street Southwest. The officer found the crash after arriving in the area to look for the source of a power outage that had just occurred. The investigation into this crash is now complete, and I want to share the findings with you today. I believe it is important for us as a community to understand what happened in the early morning hours of April 10th. The idea here is not to alter the memories of those who died, but to learn from what happened and to work as a community to prevent something like this from happening again. Our investigation determined that the 2007 Jeep Liberty, that was being driven by Zach Hartley, was traveling well in excess of the posted speed limit of 30 miles per hour. The Liberty's speed made it impossible for it to remain on the roadway as it passed under the railroad viaduct and entered the curve approaching Monroe Avenue. The vehicle then left the roadway, striking guide wires for an electrical pole. The vehicle continued on the grass until it then struck a tree. Hartley was operating the vehicle with a blood alcohol level in excess of the legal limit of 0.08. Upon coming to rest, the Liberty caught fire. The fire quickly traveled into the passenger compartment. Officers who arrived on scene were unable to open the doors of the vehicle to remove any occupants. They were also unable to slow the spread of the fire. The Mesa City Fire Department arrived and extinguished the fire and found that none of the occupants had survived the crash. The initial investigation was difficult because we were unable to identify passengers in the vehicle. We decided to put out a press release identifying their race and gender along with a vehicle description. That was useful to us in identifying the other occupants. We received the final autopsy report on June 14th. After completing our review and investigation, we reached out to the families to share with them the details of what happened. Autopsy results showed that Zach Hartley had a blood alcohol level that was in excess of the legal limit of 0.08. All of the vehicle occupants died as a result of the crash impact or injuries sustained as a result of the crash. Hartley and the front seat passenger were wearing seat belts at the time of the crash. We do not believe that any of the backseat passengers were wearing seat belts when the collision occurred. We have two photographs to release to you today. It is our intention that these photographs help people to understand the severity of the crash impact. They illustrate how speed and driver impairment affects driver decision-making and vehicle control. The Mesa City Police Department was assisted in this investigation by the Mesa City Fire Department and the City of Mason City Operations and Maintenance Division. At this time, I'll take questions from you related to the crash. Bob?
Can you determine the speed, or was the speed determined exactly? And I guess I would follow up as well. You said that Hartley's blood alcohol level was 0.08 or above 0.08. Do you have an exact number that you would like to release?
Right. We do believe that the lowest possible speed the vehicle was traveling at the time of the crash was 79 miles per hour. It is a posted 30-mile-an-hour speed limit there on Highway 122. We are not going to release Mr. Hartley's blood alcohol level at this point. The only criminal charges that could have stemmed from this incident related to the crash were vehicular homicide charges on Hartley had he survived. And so at this point, because we will not be entering a criminal docket affidavit, we are not going to release that at this time.
As a father, what was your reaction to hearing all this?
The aftermath or initially?
Yeah, when you got all the crash reports together, you're writing this press release, you're putting things together. What's your reaction to it?
What I looked for as we put this all together was the opportunity for someone to intervene and stop this that night. I think I asked myself that a bunch as we kind of went through it, and there just wasn't an opportunity. No one called the police to report erratic driving. Nobody called to report that there was a small event that people were attending where they were consuming alcohol. We didn't have an opportunity to intervene, and I don't think anybody else did either. And so at the end of that realization, I think, was the fact that as a community, this is a challenge for us. If we think this is okay and we allow it and condone it by not reporting it, then we need to do something to change the attitudes and the approach to socialization and events that are fun for young people to avoid having something like this happen again.
I talked to the family earlier today, one of the families, and they talked about surveillance video. Can you talk about that at all?
Yeah, we went back and were able to retrieve some surveillance video as a part of the investigation. that help us kind of put back together the last hours before this crash. That surveillance video was very useful to us in kind of really evaluating what really happened and putting some limit on the speculation by the community about what happened. I can tell you pretty definitively, nobody got out of that car. We believe that, we know that the people who died in the crash were the only occupants. There was no pursuit by the police or law enforcement in general. There was no drag race. Those other kinds of things that we heard. We don't believe it was a suicide attempt. We've heard that as recently as the last couple of days. And so our investigation is very certain that none of those things happened.
Cell phones?
We don't have any real evidence other than a couple of Snapchat pictures that people told us about. We're trying still in efforts to try to collect those, but most of the phones, those kind of evidence was destroyed in the crash or the fire, and so we have not been able to get a lot of substantial help from the phones of the people involved.
Was everyone drinking in the vehicle?
There was a wide array of, not a wide array, alcohol and marijuana were the only two substances that were identified in the autopsies. The only one that matters for the purpose of this case is Zach Hartley's. His blood alcohol level was in excess of 0.08, and we do not intend to speak to those other levels or who was using what that night. It really is not important for us and how the crash happened and how this happened, but it is something that we shared with the families for them to know and for them to do with as they see fit.
From your perspective, what was that like talking to the families about this?
It was hard. I think it was, I think we finally gave them news in a couple of cases that they didn't have final answers on. Some of them had already read autopsy reports and some of them hadn't. But I think it was, there's some finality to this process now that we're done with our investigation that I think hits home for them and makes today another hard day.
Chief, you mentioned about no criminal charges, but in your investigation, I mean, were these people at a certain location and then came back this way, or what can you expound on that?
Yeah, we know that they loosely based out of an apartment that night. And then on two separate occasions, they obtained alcohol from a local retail establishment. The circumstances of those, that alcohol was stolen. It was not paid for. And so to that regard, in holding people accountable, there isn't a way to do that in regard to how they got the alcohol. The question did come up about where they were drinking, the social hosting ordinance and things like that. And our social hosting ordinance requires on-premises accountability for the host. And at the point that we reviewed all the case facts, when we had it all put together, the gathering was actually outside of an apartment, in an area that's contiguous to a public space in that apartment complex. And so we really didn't feel that a social hosting charge for the tenant in that apartment was appropriate given the circumstances.
What would your message be to that person, even though charges aren't going toward it?
Right. I would say in the future to anybody, if you have somebody on your property who's engaged in a violation of social host, there's a provision in the ordinance that requires calling the police, calling local law enforcement. It's a countywide ordinance, my mistake. But it puts the burden on the tenant or the property owner to call local law enforcement to deal with that. And that would be what I would encourage people to do in the future.
Does this go beyond drinking and driving?
I think so. I think this is how kids get alcohol. This is what kids do with their free time here. And I think it's a community story. And I think we as leaders and families and parents and schools and educators and health officials, we need to do something to work hard to change some of that demeanor and that attitude that kids have towards drinking and driving.
You said you talked to parents. What was the message you were getting from parents about getting this today?
I've got a summary statement that I'll close with when we're done, and I'll share that with you at that time.
Is this the kind of case that keeps you up at night?
I think this kind of problem, you just don't see single vehicle crashes that end like this. I mean, it's just, I don't think anybody in our department had experienced anything like this before it happened. And so it certainly stayed with the officers that responded that night. And we're going to keep close tabs on them. But I also think that absolutely from the standpoint of loss of life in our community, we can't be tolerant of this. And so we need to work hard to put systems in place that keep us from having to go through this again.
So do you ramp up the education effort with the schools or other agencies to maybe put them on the front line of sharing this message?
We're going to talk more about that in the near future. I don't have an answer for you for sure on that. I know internally we're looking at a couple of things related to our school resource officer being in the schools and what that looks like moving ahead. I don't have hard answers for you on that are definitive, but certainly that's on our radar. It was before, it most certainly is now.
Is it still hard to know that no one could get out?
I think yes and no. I think as a first responder, when you pull up on, having done this a couple of times before myself, I think you believe that if you train and respond appropriately every time, you can affect the outcome. And I think that until you live through one where you learn later that you cannot, it's hard to live with. And I think we've been able to share with our staff that we couldn't have changed the outcome. And so despite their best efforts that night, the outcome wouldn't have been any different. And so I think that, does it make it any easier? No. Does it make it easier to understand? Yes. And so I think from that standpoint, that will be useful to our staff and our department in moving ahead beyond this.
Do you think our community should move ahead on this?
I think we should. I mean, I think I don't think it's good for us to sit and wallow in sorrow and loss. I think that we have to learn from these opportunities, but I think it's important that we pick ourselves up and we move ahead and we make a difference going ahead and not letting something like this happen again. Other questions? All right, I've got my closing statement is I give the families a chance to, Jason, I guess I should ask, this is Jason Hughey, one of our investigators who led the investigation. Anything you want to add to what I've covered so far? Okay. And we gave the families then a chance to kind of have an opportunity for us to represent them to some degree to you in leaving this. What's that look like? So I'll share with you what some of the comments were here. While we want the families to share the results of the investigation, they asked us to share the following messages with our community. They appreciate the love, care, and support shown to them by the community through your messages and your prayers. They want to help prevent future tragedies and shared these thoughts. First, thanks to all of the first responders who were involved in the crash response and investigation. Number two, kids and adults alike, don't get into a vehicle with a drinking driver, period. That message was pretty clear to us. Please don't let this tragedy be in vain. Think about the decisions that you make and don't let this happen again here. For parents, be a nosy parent. Know what your kids are doing and be aware. Know who they're with. Don't be scared to talk to your kids about their decisions. And finally, just continued prayers for the families and friends of Zach Hartley, Dante Foster, Alex Whipke, Sidney Alcorn, and Roderick Lewis. Any questions? All right, thanks for coming today.